So we're going through the book of Acts. We're in Acts chapter 17 today. So our objective is to understand a mission of God that takes place throughout our life, not just on Sunday, Monday to Saturday mission. And we're going to also refer back to the previous chapter as we go through this. So I want us to start with Acts 17. Acts 17. It says, now when they, meaning Paul and his companions, had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Then Paul, as was his custom, went into them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I have preached to you is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks, not a few of the leading women, also joined Paul and Silas. But the Jews who were not persuaded became envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace, and gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brethren to the rulers of the city, and they cried out, those who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus. And they troubled the crowd and all the rulers of the city when they heard these things. And when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. So we're going to talk about turning the world upside down. Somebody say, turning the world upside down.
Turning the world upside down.
That's what they were known as, people who turned the world upside down. That's something good. I want to be known as someone who turned the world upside down. So notice that implies not just a church service or amongst Christians, but it's talking about affecting the world. And so the gospel is called to affect the world. And so as we go back to the first verse, and we see that Paul, as his custom, in the second verse, went to the synagogue. The first thing he did in every city, because it says that was his custom, was he went to the synagogue, and for 3 Sabbaths, 3 Saturdays in a row, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. And so the word reason means they had discussions. It wasn't like he got up and preached, but they would go back and forth. They would dialogue, and his goal was to explain and demonstrate from the Bible that Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead. And so his audience were Jewish people. They were familiar with the Old Testament, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and they were familiar with the prophets, which would be Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, and then the minor prophets, which were the smaller books that were called, some of the prophets were Amos and Micah, and Jonah and Amos and some of those other books. And there were 66 books in the whole Bible, but at that point he was only referring to the first 39 that were in the Old Testament. So he was encouraging them to believe that Jesus, based on the prophets of old and based on the books of Moses, he was trying to prove to them that Jesus indeed was the Christ, that he was the one who had to suffer, die, rise from the dead, based on their own writings. And so we find that when Paul went to the synagogue, when he was preaching to Jewish people, he was able to use the Bible. Then when we go to other parts of the book of Acts, and we see how he approached non-Jews, he never opened the Bible when he preached about Jesus. He used nature. We can find that in Acts 14, and later on in Acts 17. We'll read this in a few weeks. He used creation. He used the created order. And so Christians make a mistake when they use religious language that's only familiar to the church, when they're trying to share the gospel with those who don't know the Lord. The exception being that they were brought up in church and they're not serving God, that it's different. Or if they had some kind of familiarity with the Bible, that's different. Now, it doesn't mean it's wrong for you to open the Bible and share with those who don't know the Lord. That's a powerful experience. I've done that many, many times. But it's different from assuming they know the Bible. How many know that? It's one thing to read the Bible to those who don't know the Lord, but it's different to believe that they understand and assume everything. It used to be when I was first a believer that the average person knew that there were two testaments. There was the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now people don't know that. It used to be that they knew the story of Christ. And many people don't know the story of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. They have no idea, even though they live in this country. And so we have to assume if somebody is not a believer that they don't know anything. So you have to take the Bible in a way that you explain the very, very basics of the gospel. And sometimes you have to start even in the very beginning, in the book of Genesis, to explain that man fell into sin, that humankind fell into sin. Some people don't even know what sin is. They don't even realize that there is right or wrong, and sin, and goodness, and truth, and evil, and wickedness. They don't understand the basics of that which we assume. And so we have to look at the approach Paul had when he was with Jewish people who had a knowledge of the Bible. He used the Bible. I mean, he didn't have to prove he didn't have to assume the existence of God. They already believed in God. They already believed in a lot of the same things. Now, interesting, Bible never tries to prove that God exists. Bible says that you're a fool if you don't, because of nature. And so what Paul did, he just used nature. All you got to do is study science. Science and religion are not opposed. Actually, our view of science should really arise out of starting with a belief in the Creator. It's mathematically impossible to believe that everything came by accident. All you have to do is study the human anatomy and how difficult it would be for even the ear to develop perfectly in sync with the rest of the body and the nervous system and everything else. What would the chances be of that happening by accident, just by matter and motion? I mean, it's just, so there are mathematicians that have proved the foolishness of believing that all this came by some kind of macroevolution, natural force by chance, because they have to say by chance, because if they said by design, then well, who designed it? Then it goes back to God. So those who don't believe in God believe all this came by accident. Now there are Christians who believe that God used evolution. There are Christians who don't believe that. And I'm not going to get into that now, but the point is to say that it all came by chance is insane. And it's not mathematically possible. So because of that, nature was called the 67th book of the Bible, because you have 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New, that's 66 books. So oftentimes the Bible, not just Paul, Isaiah, all the prophets, have gone to nature, have gone to creation, and have used that to talk about God's character, God's ways. So God has placed nature in a way that it glorifies God and it points to the Creator. There have been people who've become born again, who've received Christ and never heard the gospel, but they just believed in God because of nature. And there's testimonies of people that just prayed to this God who made everything, this God who made the sun, and God would reveal himself supernaturally. And so we have many testimonies of that I've read through the years. So people are held accountable to God, by God, on the judgment seat, even if they never heard the gospel, because of the power of creation. So when Paul went to the Jews, he used the scriptures. When he went to the Gentiles or non-Jews, he didn't crack open the Bible because they didn't have any reference point. They didn't know anything about it. So we see here that the result of this ministry in the synagogue was profound. He said many Greek people who feared God, those were people who didn't get circumcised, but they still attended the synagogue, and not a few of the leading women. There were prominent business women who came to Christ. as a result of his ministry. So that shows us that the gospel is not just for the poor people. Gospel constantly affected city officials and people of great wealth. The gospel is not just for the down and out, it's for the up and in. And so God doesn't just love poor people, he loves all people, and he wants to reach everybody with the gospel. And so as we go through this, we want to think about, wait a minute, how did and why did they get called those who turned the world upside down? Why was that what people referred to them or described them as? And right here we see that they affected people who didn't know God, and even prominent business people. They affected them. And then in verse 5 we see the Jews who were not persuaded became envious and took evil men from the marketplace and gathered a mob, and the whole city was in an uproar. When you look at the book of Acts, you see that everywhere Paul went, there was either a riot or a revival in the streets. There was never neutrality. There was always some incredible effect, whether negative or positive. A lot of times both at the same time, a positive but a negative effect. Because people who are influenced by the enemy do not want the gospel to go forth. They will do anything they can. The enemy will incite people to stop you from hearing the word, whether it's public officials, whether it's friends, family. There's going to be opposition to anything that God wants to do. So there was a big uproar. And then they attacked the person they thought was helping Paul the most. They attacked his house. And they dragged him out. His name was Jason and some brethren. And they brought him to the rulers of the city. And this is what they said. These men who have turned the world upside down have come here. Wow, I'd love for people to say that about me. Now, they weren't necessarily complimenting them. They were saying that they had an impact on the world. Again, wherever they went, it was either a riot or a revival. So, but there was an impact. Now, today, if 80% of the church is closed down, the community wouldn't even know about it. It's a big difference. Here we see the impact is in the city. The impact is in the community. Right? Now, whenever you say the word, I'm going to church, shows that you don't believe this. When you say I'm going to church, you're saying I'm going to a building. And you look and you see a church building and you say, there's a church on 43rd and 4th. That's not a church. That's a building that houses the church. You see how you've been brainwashed? You think that the activity of God is supposed to take place in a building on Sunday. And you look at the book of Acts, that's never the case. Most of the activity of God took place outside of the building. It was never ever limited to a building and never limited to Sunday. It was always something that affected society. That's why they said those who turn the world upside down are here. Okay? And what we have to understand is the context of this story. Why did they say they who turned the world upside down? Let's just go to the previous chapter. Remember chapter 16. Chapter 16, we see what happened. Paul went to a place of prayer by the river. He happened to see a woman who was a prominent seller of purple. She was a business lady, had a lot of money and influence, and they led this woman to Christ. And not only did she come to Christ, her whole family came to Christ. Her whole household came to Christ. And so that made a big impact. Now, that wasn't in a building. That wasn't in the synagogue. That wasn't in a church building. That was in a riverbed area, resulting in her family coming to Christ. And that was the beginning of the church of Philippi. That was the church in Western Europe. So the early church, the influence of God started with a woman who was a business lady and brought the disciples in her house and they started a church in her house. That's how the church of Philippi started, and that's how the gospel started from Western Europe. Powerful. Again, prominent woman. Then we see in the next few verses of chapter 16, as Paul was preaching, a woman, a slave, one was a prominent woman who got saved. Now this one was a slave who began following Paul everywhere he went. And this slave was crying out, "These are servants of the Most High God telling you the way of salvation." Now, Paul got agitated, and a few days later, he commanded the spirit of divination that was in her to come out. Now, why would he be agitated if she's preaching the truth? And this also shows you that the devil could preach the truth. Everything she said was correct. There was nothing in that message that was wrong. She was saying, these are servants of the Most High God. They were. And they're telling you the way of salvation. They were. They're telling you about Jesus. So the devil knows the Bible, and the devil could preach too. So then why did Paul get upset? Because he didn't want a woman who was practicing divination to attach herself and get credit for the truth. You see how the enemy works? The enemy will use your name. He'll use this church. And then if somebody thinks that that is true, if Paul didn't say anything, they would have said, well, Paul agrees because he's not saying anything. And if that part of what she's saying is true, then everything else she's doing is true. That means divination is okay. Fortune telling is not okay. Fortune telling is a work of the enemy. Horoscopes is a work of the enemy. Palm reading is a work of the enemy. These magic emblems and Ouija boards and tarot cards, all of this stuff is condemned in the Old Testament because the source of its power, and it does have power. I don't know if you ever tried playing with a Ouija board. That stuff is real and dangerous. It really moves without you moving it. It is demonic, and people have been messed up for the rest of their life because of playing with that stuff. So the enemy was bringing out the truth. Why? In a wise way, because if Paul, he knew he couldn't beat Paul, I might as well join him. Paul didn't say anything, he's trying to trick Paul. Then people then go to this woman for spiritual advice about Jesus. And now they have two worlds. They have those into witchcraft, now those into Christianity. But light can't have anything to do with darkness, even if they're preaching the truth, even if they are agreeing what we're saying. If they are believing the wrong thing, and if they are ultimately bringing people down the wrong path, you can't allow that to be what is true in the eyes of people that are friends. I remember about a week, 2 ago, Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on my door. And usually I don't have the time to talk to them, and this is another time I didn't. And I said, look, guys, I'll give you 5 minutes. And very sweet couple. My heart went out to them. Really sweet couple. They were young missionaries in their 20s. And I gave, in 5 minutes, I proved them wrong with their own Bible. And they were like, and the lady started asking me, so what translation should I use? And I started telling her the best translations. I told her why her translation was wrong, why her founder was sued by the High Court of Ontario in the early 20th century because he claimed to know Greek and didn't know it, and he wrote the Bible, he didn't know the first thing about the translations. I got into all of that. She said, oh, what translation should I use? And I told her what the best one is. And then I said, now let me pray for you guys. Oh, no. But you see, you could say, well, they read the Bible, they preach the Bible, leave them alone. No, they're leading people astray.
Yes.
By using the Bible,
Yes.
That's how the enemy operates. 80% of what they say may be true, but it's that 20% that's deadly. How do you catch a rat? With peanut butter. You just put a little bit of poison in it. If somebody is serving God 80%, but 20% they're condoning and 20% of your life is off kilter, and you're intentionally living in sin, you are a bad example to everybody else. You understand? So you're actually making people think that they can follow Jesus while that 20% is out of kilter. So that's how the enemy fooled you. He doesn't think he's going to beat Jesus. The devil's best goal in life would be that everybody would worship Jesus and follow him at the same time. Because that would show that they're not really worshiping Jesus, because you could have no other gods before him. And that's how he gets so much of the church. They live half-baked lives. That's what God called, I think it was either Amos or Hosea. He said, you're half-baked. You're not fully with God, but you're not fully against him. That's a worse witness than you're not following God at all. So God is calling for full commitment, because he wants you to be like that woman with the spirit of divination. You're saying the truth, but you're living a wrong life. So Paul cast a demon out of her. That caused a riot because it affected the economy, because they started losing money because she couldn't tell the truth. She couldn't tell the future anymore, right? And by the way, let me just go off on this for a second. There are some people on television and YouTube and all that who are prophesying for money. They have a spirit of divination, a lot of them. Because God doesn't operate that way. They're using a gift that God has given them, and they turned it around, and they're now trying to gain financially, charging for a prophecy. Now, maybe because God's merciful, he's still operating in some of these people, but that's a wrong process. And then there are others in the name of the Lord who really are operating with a spirit of divination. That's why you got to really know the word and know what they're saying and the truth. Because the devil knows the Bible better than you do. But he takes it out of context. He twists it around so that you don't worship Jesus. And that's why you got to be careful. And so, then we see that a riot took place. Paul and Silas were arrested. Pastor Gary talked about that last week. And instead of complaining or praying for deliverance, they just worshiped. God caused an earthquake to come, and they were released. All the people who were prisoners were released, and the Philippian jailer came to Christ, and then his whole family got saved. Now, look at chapter 16. Not one of those occurrences took place in a building. Not one. Now you know why. They said, those who have turned the world upside down have come here. Christians are called to turn the world upside down. God doesn't care how many people you get in a building on Sunday. He cares about what you do on Monday. We are to bring Jesus into the world. It reminds me, again, of the last commandment Jesus gave before he went into heaven. He told us the Holy Spirit will come upon us. And we will be his witnesses. And where? He said, in Jerusalem. Notice, he named the city. We are to be his witnesses, Acts 1:8 says. In Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. Our mission is a city. We're to have gospel saturation in our communities. The gospel cannot be separated from its city. Matter of fact, the church cannot be separated from its city. Why? Because we're supposed to permeate our community with the teachings of Jesus. The enemy would love for us to be silent from Monday to Saturday and just a hallelujah on Sunday in a building that is confined to religious practice. That's the way the world wants us to be. And that's the view of most Christians, because we say, I'm going to church. But they see an empty building and that's a church. That's not a church. That's a building that houses Christians. So Sunday's main job is for us to be equipped to change the world on Monday. We're to hear what the Spirit is saying. We're to grow together in our small groups. We're to love one another. We're to mature. But our mission field is outside. Notice the names of the churches today. Most of the churches, they're called after a doctrine. First Baptist Church. What does that mean? That means we believe in baptizing adults. Word of Faith Center. Healing Center. Family Church. Everything is based on a truth. When the church in the New Testament was called by the name of its city, it implied one church, universal church, and they were not disconnected from its mission, the city. Today, we disconnect ourselves from our mission and we think, well, it's okay. We could share Christ if we want. We could, try to bring people to Jesus as part of our call. And we have evangelistic teams. In the early church, the whole church was an evangelistic team. It wasn't something that some felt led to do. They were immersed in their city. They were immersed in their region. The church was called by its city because that was never disconnected from its existence. They never disconnected its mission from its existence. People would not come to church just to get fed. They would come to church to be equipped to serve and save others. What a difference. And so instead of being called after a doctrine, they were called after their city. And that's powerful. That's why in the New Testament you have the Church of Corinth. It didn't say First Baptist Church in the city of Corinth. It didn't say Word of Faith Church in the city of Corinth. It's the Church of Corinth, the Church of Ephesus, the Church of Colossae, the Church of Ephesians, the Church of Thyatira, the Church of Smyrna. Just look at it. Because their mission field was totally a part of who they were. They were not disconnected from their city. They didn't look at their city as enemies. They looked at the city as people that God loves. And they were given up to that city. So when we see the book of Acts, it challenges the prevailing thought in the body of Christ today. I'm going to church. Well, what are you going to on Monday?
To work.
Going to church is not a building. You are the church. When you go to work on Monday, you're bringing the church into your workplace. You are a missionary wherever you go, and you never separate that from your calling. So that's why they said, these who turn the world upside down. Nowadays, it's these who have great experiences on Sunday, who have huge buildings. Those who turn the world upside down. They affected the economy, science, music. Eventually the church got rid of slavery. The church changed the nature of music. The church changed the nature of compassion, even added new vocabulary words. The word compassion wasn't even a word known in the Roman Greco culture. It wasn't until Jesus taught on the Good Samaritan that word of someone having compassion on someone who was beaten up by robbers and used their money, their wealth, which, by the way, if he wasn't wealthy, he couldn't be a good Samaritan. He used his wealth to help a person who was a victim of a mugging. And it says he had compassion on him. Well, when the gospel went to the non-Jews, Jews knew what the word compassion meant. But when it went from Jewish to the Gentile nations, as we see in the book of Acts, they said, what do you mean compassion? He had compassion. What does that word mean? They had to add a word because there was no such thing as love and compassion for other people. Someone got sick, they left them. The gospel changed the world. It wasn't confined to a building for 2 hours on Sunday. And that's why we have to unlearn a lot of what we've learned by going through the book of Acts. Then he says, after he said those who turned the world upside down have come here. And let me say one other thing. This whole thing about professional pastors And clergy is not of God either. Because now we go to church and we bring people to church to get saved, when if you look in the book of Acts, they got saved before they went to church meetings. The people have to be released to cast demons out, to heal the sick, to bring salvation. It's a street, it's a workplace dynamic. And we've relegated it to professional enterprise, like we have professional baseball players, we have professional musicians, now we have another profession, pastors, who walk around with their clergy outfits and their garments. Just because you have a clerical garb on doesn't make you a man or woman of God. Right? If you want to wear it, you can, but it doesn't make you holy just because you're wearing it. And so what we have to understand is it's a saints movement, it's a church movement, it's the body of Christ that is going to bring the gospel to the world. It's never just a few people doing it. Then the last thing they said, they who turn the world upside down have come here, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees or laws of Caesar, saying there is another king, namely Jesus. So in those days, almost every party, public ceremony, anything that had to do with an official thing, they were required as Roman citizens to burn incense to an image of Caesar. It was a way of holding the empire together, because there's so many different religions. The only thing that could hold the empire together was they demanded everyone worship Caesar as God, as a deity. And so it says here that these Christians were acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there was another king, Jesus. So all the other religions, they could coexist with praying to Caesar. They were okay with it. Let Caesar be the king of Rome, but our God will be the king of the island or the land or the forest or the water. They had gods for everything. Christianity is different. No. God made the land, the rivers, the sun, the moon. Not just the God of religion, he's the God of the earth. So we're not going to pray to any other God. We're not going to light incense to Caesar. And so they preach that Jesus is the true Caesar, contrary to the law of Rome. That is why Jesus was crucified. He wasn't crucified for religious reasons. He was crucified for political reasons. And so there are some laws Christians are called to break. There are some Christians who think that if it's the law of the land, we got to obey it. No, that's not true. If you're living in a country and they tell you you can't read the Bible, you disobey that. If they're telling you that you can't worship God, you disobey it. If they're telling you you can't attend church services, you disobey that. If they tell you that you have to abort your children like they do in China, you disobey that. If they tell you you have to marry a certain kind of couple, you disobey that if it goes against your faith. You are not to obey any law that is contrary to your biblical values. Now there's some laws you just can't help. You have to obey them because they're so intrinsic into the system. Like abortion is also part of a lot of health care programs and different things. So you can't, what are you going to do? Not have health care or, not work for your teachers union? There are certain things you can't do that much about. But there are other things you can do. And then that's why we need people to become gatekeepers to change the world. And so we have to realize that being a Christian is countercultural. Not as much in this country with the laws as in some others, but it could head that way. But there's only one king over the earth. He's not just the God of Sunday services, not just a religious God. He's a military God. He's a political God, the economic God, the God of the sun, the moon, the stars, the God of everything you own. And his name is Jesus. And anything that's contrary to that, we are called to resist and not submit to. So let's just pray for a minute. Father, as these Christians troubled this city, and as they had riots or revival everywhere they went, that you would make us salt and light of the world, not just of the church. We would not just have conversations with other believers, but we would have conversations with those who don't know you, showing the love of God, showing, oh God, the benefit of Christianity to the world, not just to the church. Showing, oh God, even the benefit of the quality of life that Christianity has brought historically to the world. Even women's rights and sanctity of life and understanding romance and marriage, compassion, resulting in the building of hospitals, bringing orchestral music under anointed songwriters like Beethoven and Mozart and Handel and others. Father, the benefit of Christianity is that which makes us the light of the world and turns the world upside down. God, that you continue to make us those who turn the world upside down. At this time, we're going to invest in this church, in this gospel, in the call of God to bring the gospel, to be a witness into our city, into Staten Island and beyond. We're going to invest right now. Let's do that in Jesus' name.
Amen.